Have you ever seen a lone combat medic take on an entire squad of alien enforcers inside a small-town clinic? That's exactly what happens in our most heart-stopping moment, right when Marcos Flynn faces down the Gendaran team determined to drag Zora Avanth off-world. Sparks fly, walls are scorched, and everything hangs in the balance. If you're eager to find out how one unassuming therapist's courage could stand against advanced alien authority, and how Zora found the strength to fight for her own future, you won't want to miss the full story. In this unfolding saga of hope, tenacity, and interstellar diplomacy, every chapter offers more surprises. Want to know if they can protect Zora's freedom and prove that Earth therapy really can achieve the impossible? Stick around until the very end. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you even more extraordinary tales like this one. Marcos Flynn ran a practiced hand over the aching shoulder of Mrs. Turner, an elderly resident of Serenity Creek, Wyoming, a place so small it barely registered on most state maps. Outside the lone window of Flynn's physical therapy clinic, rain battered the glass with insistent taps. The sound reminded him of a gentle drum beat echoing through the stillness of a late Friday night. Inside, the overhead fluorescent lights hummed with a soft buzz that mixed strangely with the steady ticking of an antique clock on the wall. As the clock's hands edged past 8, Mrs. Turner closed her eyes in relief, momentarily oblivious to her surroundings. "You've really got magic hands, Mr. Flynn," she sighed, her thinning white hair gleaming faintly under the glow of the overhead lamps. "My late husband said the same thing back in the day. And you're a doctor too, right?" Marcos offered a small grin, shaking his head. "Just call me Marcos, Mrs. Turner. I'm not a doctor, just a physical therapist who knows his way around muscles and joints." He shifted his technique, pressing his thumb into a stubborn knot near her shoulder blade. Treating arthritic joints and chronic pain was his bread and butter, and normally the ordinary routine helped keep the case of his past at bay. But tonight, with the rain pattering against the windows, his thoughts drifted, unbidden, to old memories of conflict during Operation Horizon Storm. It was an era he had hoped to leave behind, but it crept into his mind whenever the weather turned grim. "Either way," Mrs. Turner added, her voice still dreamy, "you've got quite the touch. When my granddaughter Gina visits next week, I'll have to introduce you. She's studying biochemistry, and—" A sudden chime at the clinic's front door sliced through Mrs. Turner's chatter. In Serenity Creek, few people ventured out during a downpour this heavy, especially not at night. Marcos straightened, half expecting Darren Brooks, another patient with a knack for last-minute, late-night appointments, to limp through the entrance. Instead, what he saw made him freeze in mid-motion. A figure slid through the door in a chair that hovered a full foot off the floor. Marcos's gaze dropped to the base of the device, where soft cerulean lights pulsed rhythmically. He had never witnessed such a seamless anti-gravity mechanism in person before. But it wasn't the futuristic chair that stole his breath. It was the occupant. Her skin shimmered with a dusky lavender sheen, and her features were almost human, but sharpened in a way that made her look like an ethereal carving. High cheekbones, full lips, and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly gold created an immediate sense that she hailed from far beyond Earth's borders. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman said, her voice tinged with an accent Marcos couldn't place. "I'm looking for rehabilitation services. This establishment came highly recommended." Mrs. Turner's mouth dropped open. Marcos forced himself back into a semblance of professional composure, though his heart thudded against his ribcage. He had spent years on battlefronts, patching up injured soldiers of all stripes, yet this was something wholly different, something he'd never expected to see in the quiet corner of the world he had retreated to. Marcos cleared his throat, gesturing gently for Mrs. Turner to sit up. "I think we'll finish up here, Mrs. T. Same time next week?" He helped the elderly woman off the table, but his eyes continually strayed to the newcomer. Mrs. Turner gathered her belongings, casting intermittent, stunned glances over her shoulder as she headed out into the rain. The alien visitor guided her anti-gravity chair closer, the hum of the device making the overhead lights flicker slightly. Up close, her presence was even more striking. Her luminous golden eyes had a fierce intensity, as though she were constantly assessing her environment. She wore a sleek jumpsuit of deep charcoal, formal yet functional, likely an official uniform or something akin. "My name is Zora Avinth," she said, inclining her head with a polite but careful nod. "I serve as an envoy for the Gendaran Interplanetary Council. My records indicate that you, Marcos Flynn, are the most successful physical rehabilitation specialist in this region when dealing with complex trauma cases." Marcos felt his eyebrows rise. "That's quite specific. Serenity Creek isn't exactly known for handling the world's most complicated injuries." She pressed a slender hand to the control panel on the arm of her hover chair, and the device's lights danced in response. "Perhaps not. Yet the data I've gathered suggests you have a history that extends beyond rural therapy. Operation Horizon Storm, 2031 to 2034, attached to the 14th Field Medic Division. That's not typical of a small-town practitioner." A chill ran down Marcos's spine at the mention of that classified operation. It was the kind of detail that shouldn't be readily available, let alone to someone from another planet. He reflexively touched the faint scar along his forearm, hidden beneath his scrubs. "How did you get that information?" he asked quietly. "I have the diplomatic clearance," Zora said. Her tone was neither apologetic nor smug, just matter of fact. "I've come to you because no one else can help me." Marcos studied her, the hum of the overhead lights seeming to grow louder. "Well, Ms. Avant, I'm not exactly sure what you think I can do. I'm just a physical therapist. You're obviously not from around here." Her slight smile displayed a flash of silver in her eyes that wasn't quite a reflection. "I'm Jindarin. 10 years ago, I was injured during a cultural exchange mission on your planet. Something caused a surge of unknown energy in the mountains of the American West, and I lost all motor function below my waist. Jindarin doctors have tried everything. Earth doctors have tried everything. No one can find a single tangible reason for my paralysis. But the success stories of your prior patients, coupled with your unorthodox methods, caught my attention." Marcos's first impulse was to laugh in disbelief, but he resisted. After the war, he had hoped for a quiet life in a small town, far from the chaos of high-stakes medical emergencies. And now, apparently, an alien diplomat with advanced technology was rolling right through his front door, convinced he could help her walk again. He felt his mouth go dry, the memories of the battlefield swirling in his mind. 10 years without walking," he said finally. "And you want me to do something all those top-level specialists and advanced technologies couldn't do?" "Correct," Zora replied, folding her hands in her lap. "I believe your approach might offer what we have overlooked, a blend of skill, intuition, and what humans call a human touch." Marcos's gaze swept over her hover chair, noting how it hovered steadily even without visible thrusters. A dull azure glow shimmered near the base. Glancing back up, he studied Zora's face for any sign of insincerity. She appeared earnest, though he suspected there was more to her story. "Look," he began, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "I don't claim to have magic hands, no matter what Mrs. Turner says. I was a medic in the war, sure. I saw enough injuries to last a lifetime. But what you're describing, it's way beyond my scope." Zora blinked slowly, her gaze unwavering. "I'm aware of your disclaimers, but consider that my condition has stumped experts on multiple worlds. If you think of it as an ordinary spinal injury, you'd be correct that the outlook is grim. But according to Gendaran scans and those from Earth specialists, there is no physical or neurological damage to explain it. It's as though the signals simply refuse to pass beyond a certain point." Marcos bit his lower lip. "That's bizarre. I've never heard of a case with no trace of damage." "That's because we suspect it's not purely physical," Zora admitted. "We believe some form of energy, potentially unique to Earth, disrupted the channels my species uses for mobility. If we can figure out how to reawaken or clear those channels, the nerves might reconnect, so to speak." Her words stirred something in Marcos, a memory of patching up wounded soldiers under conditions that defied logic. During Operation Horizon Storm, he'd encountered injuries from experimental weaponry that defied conventional medical wisdom. He had been forced to improvise, using a combination of mechanical engineering and hands-on therapy. Perhaps that was why she'd sought him out. "How can you be certain I'm not just going to make it worse?" Marcus asked, slipping back into the role of cautious professional. Zora's expression softened, a faint vulnerability crossing her features. Because I've tried everything else. This is my last avenue of hope. An uneasy silence filled the clinic, broken only by the rhythmic tap of rain on the window. Marcos felt a tug of empathy he couldn't quite shrug off. He remembered the battered looks on soldiers' faces, men and women who thought they'd never stand again, or never hold their children again. He cleared his throat. All right, Ms. Avam, if I take you on as a patient, I need to run a thorough evaluation first. We'll do a standard assessment, as standard as we can manage given that you're from another planet. If at any point I think this is beyond me, or if it's dangerous, we'll have to stop. Zora nodded, relief evident. Agreed, and please call me Zora. Marcos then, he said, forcing a small grin. No fancy titles here. Let's start with your range of motion. We'll do some basic strength testing too, or at least see what your body can handle. The flicker of the fluorescent lights cast oddly shifting shadows as he led Zora deeper into the clinic, the weight of an unexpected responsibility settling over him. He'd come to Serenity Creek to escape precisely this kind of high-stakes scenario. But now, with a single unsteady breath, he found himself back on a front line, just not the kind he was used to. Marcos directed Zora to the largest treatment area in his modest clinic, where 2 therapy tables, a set of bars for walking assistance, and various equipment formed the heart of his practice. The walls were lined with certificates and pictures, smiling patients hugging him after successful recoveries, though none from his military days. The old uniform was packed away, out of sight. Zora pressed a button on her wire and it smoothly transitioned into a flat, stable platform. Marcos watched with a fascination he tried to hide. Jandaran engineering, he thought, is leagues ahead of anything Earth has right now. He still couldn't hear any mechanical whir or see any tangible supports, only that soft blue glow. Take your time adjusting, he said gently, helping her lie down on the platform. I'll start with your feet, check reflexes, and move upward. If anything hurts or feels wrong, let me know immediately. She nodded, but her composed demeanor faltered slightly when he placed a hand on her left ankle. You humans have such an ingrained notion of consent before touching, she remarked, her tone mildly curious. On Jandara, once you entrust yourself to a healer, they proceed as they see fit, no questions asked. Marcos gave a half shrug. Different cultures, different protocols. I like to keep my patients in the loop, especially if they can punch me through a wall if they get upset. A slight smile tugged at Zora's lips. We Jandarans are indeed physically stronger, but you'd be surprised how well we can harness that strength when needed. I'll do my best not to toss you across the room as long as you don't give me reason. Marcos managed a short laugh. Deal. Gently he rotated her ankle, noting the smoothness of her skin. It felt almost like polished stone, yet still warm. An odd tingle sparked through his fingertips. He pressed lightly on her calf muscle. Any sensation? Barely, she replied. It's more of a dull pressure, as if there's a barrier between my mind and my body. He continued along both legs, bending her knees, testing reflexes with a small mallet. There was no reflexive jerk, only an occasional shift in muscle tension. Still, he noticed no obvious mechanical or structural issues. As you said, it's almost like the nerves are intact, but the signals aren't getting through, he murmured, scribbling notes on a tablet. Zora turned her head slightly to watch him. Yes, and trust me, we've done countless scans, MRI equivalents, quantum resonance imaging, you name it. Every test suggests nothing is damaged, but function never returned. Marcos moved up to her hips and torso, his focus intensifying. Then there must be a hidden factor, something your scans can't detect. Maybe it's an energetic block that can't be seen with conventional machines, or even advanced Jandaran technology. Our bodies, human or Jandaran, can do strange things. I'm hoping you're right, Zora said softly, that hint of longing in her voice as she stared at the ceiling, hoping you can see what others have missed. Once Marcos completed the initial physical exam, Zora pressed another series of buttons on the control panel. A holographic display shimmered to life above her, depicting an anatomical figure that resembled a humanoid form, but with noticeable differences. The spinal column appeared segmented into more sections than a human's, and iridescent lines snaked through the body, possibly representing the energy channels she had mentioned. These are my neural conduits, Zora explained, gesturing to the glowing lines. Gendarans have an enhanced system of energy flow that works in tandem with our musculoskeletal structure. When we're healthy, these conduits allow us to channel considerable strength and resilience. Marcos leaned in, eyes narrowed as he absorbed the rotating image. During the war, I saw a handful of cases with what we called exotic injuries, inflicted by experimental weapons. Some of those injuries resembled disruptions in normal nerve pathways, but none had quite this complexity. You're saying these lines feed your muscle response? Precisely, Anya replied, magnifying the diagram to display the nerve-like threads wrapping around each vertebra. Now, after the accident, the portion of these conduits below my waist dimmed, like a circuit that was turned off. My doctors couldn't figure out how to switch it back on. Frowning, Marcos watched the hologram. It could be that the trauma was so localized that standard healing didn't detect or fix it. If it's some form of intangible energy block, well, I can't guarantee we can remove it, but we can try hands-on manipulation of those pathways. Sometimes the body just needs a reminder of how to function. Zora peered at him intently. And you think that's possible using your earth therapy methods? Marcos exhaled, shoulders sagging a bit. I won't lie, I'm stepping into uncharted territory here. But I've always believed that true healing blends science with something more intuitive. While I was deployed, I helped soldiers with injuries that baffled even our best doctors. It was often a combination of physical therapy, mental support, and a willingness to adapt that made the difference. No fancy equipment, just me, my hands, and whatever creative solutions I could come up with. Her gaze flickered over the old photographs on the wall. He never displayed images from his wartime days, but she might have sensed the weight behind his words. So you'll do it? You'll help me? Marcos hesitated. He recalled the vow he'd made to himself years ago. No more high-stakes cases that could drag him back into the emotional pit he fought to climb out of. But seeing Zora's determination, her unwavering belief that he could accomplish the impossible, triggered a sense of responsibility he couldn't ignore. I'll try, he finally said, the simplest yet most profound promise he could offer. A small, grateful smile touched Zora's lips. Thank you. Marcos began taking more thorough notes, including angles of motion, muscle tension, and a reference to her unusual spinal conduction. He would need to cross-reference it with any available research on Gendaran biology, though that was likely in classified archives. We'll start slow, he said. 3 sessions a week, maybe more if you can handle it. And if at any point this seems risky or ineffective, we reevaluate. Agreed. Zora powered down the hologram. I'll provide you with any medical data I can. Some of it might be beyond current Earth science, but I trust your resourcefulness will make up for that gap. Marcos let out a quiet laugh. Resourcefulness is my middle name, but you'll have to be patient with me. I'm still learning to pronounce Gendaran, was it? She gave a wry grin. Yes, Gendaran, and for the record, you're doing a decent job so far. They arranged the first official therapy session for the following evening, past normal clinic hours. Marcos insisted on the timing not just to avoid unsettling his small-town clientele with an alien visitor, but also because his best work often happened in the quiet hush of night. Zora arrived promptly at 8, her hover chair gliding smoothly into the main room. She carried a data stick filled with Gendaran medical literature that made Marcos's head swim after just a few minutes of skimming. This is like reading a physics textbook from the future, he muttered, glancing at the crystalline diagrams depicting quantum fields and biological resonance. Zora quirked an eyebrow. Our society has had centuries longer to develop medical science. Don't worry, I'll serve as your translator. They quickly got to work. Marcos guided her onto the therapy table, placing careful hands along her spine and hips to assess muscle tone. He had set up a soft ambient lamp in place of the harsher fluorescence, lending the clinic a gentler glow. The rhythmic patter of rain outside returned, as if the sky was keeping watch. I'm going to try something different tonight, he informed her, pressing lightly on a spot just below her ribcage. I want to see if applying manual pressure to certain nerve clusters triggers a response. Zora nodded. If you find the correct conduit path, I might feel a tingle or warmth. Marcos began a slow, methodical exploration, comparing her body to the holographic images in his mind. At first, nothing happened, just the usual observation of muscle tension. Then he noticed a subtle vibration along her lower spine, akin to faint static on the tips of his fingers. He gently circled his thumbs over that spot, and a sudden flicker of movement caught his eye. Zora's right foot twitched. "Marcos!" she gasped, half disbelief and half exhilaration. That hasn't happened in a decade. Adrenaline spiked through him, as if he had just witnessed a small miracle. "Did you do that deliberately?" he asked, keeping his voice calm even though excitement buzzed in his veins. "No," she said, breathless. "It just happened." He tried the maneuver again, but the flicker died away, the static-like sensation receding. "Looks like it's not fully consistent," he muttered, rubbing his brow. "But even a single movement is a breakthrough, right?" Zora pressed her palm flat against the therapy table, golden eyes brimming with an emotion Marcos recognized as hope. "You've done more in one session than a decade of advanced Jindarin medicine could. That has to mean something." He felt a stir of pride, but also caution. Progress in physical therapy often came in fits and starts, and the complexities of a Jindarin physiology magnified the difficulty. Still, seeing her foot move, even briefly, hammered home the notion that his old instincts for solving seemingly unsolvable problems hadn't dulled. "All right," he said, quietly clearing his throat. "We should keep at it, but let's not overdo it tonight. We'll build on this in future sessions." Zora nodded, her expression resolute. "Whatever it takes. I haven't felt this close to standing in years." When their session concluded, the room hummed with unspoken tension, a curious mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Marcos helped Zora settle back into her hover chair, noticing how she lingered, as though reluctant to leave the circle of warm light that had become their shared space. He felt a similar reluctance himself, a strange protective urge that both intrigued and unsettled him. He walked her toward the front of the clinic, the overhead lamp casting shadows that wavered with each step. Rain hammered more fiercely against the windows, reminiscent of how it used to beat down on tarps in the war zone camps. Back then, the oppressive gloom of storms made him uneasy, conjuring images of stretcher-bound soldiers in mud-slick tents. Tonight, however, the sound felt almost comforting, as if the weather was on their side. Zora paused just short of the door. "Thank you, Marcos," she said, her voice subdued. "I know you're taking a chance on me, on this. You didn't have to." He shoved his hands into his pockets, forcing a casual shrug. "I'm a therapist. It's my job to help people, whether they're from Earth or Jindarao. Besides, I guess I'm still addicted to lost causes." A faint smirk curved her lips. "Well, you'll have plenty to keep you busy then." She lowered her gaze for a beat, as if searching for the right words. "I should warn you, my people do not all share my optimism. If word spreads that I'm receiving unsanctioned treatment from a human, there may be pushback." Marcos's jaw tightened, a flicker of old resolve igniting within him. "Anyone who wants to give you a hard time will have to go through me first." He kept his tone light, but something serious lurked beneath it. He wasn't naive. Interplanetary politics could be just as treacherous as the conflicts he had known on the battlefield. "Brave words," she remarked, inclining her head in a gesture somewhere between gratitude and respect. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." Then she was gone, disappearing into the downpour and leaving behind only the gentle trace of an ozone-like scent, something uniquely hers that lingered in the air long after she departed. Marco stood there, still watching the door, until the chill from outside seeped into the clinic. He locked up, made sure the windows were secure, and returned to tidy up the treatment space. But no matter how methodically he went about his closing routine, his mind drifted back to the spark of that moment, her foot jerking under his touch, the startled hope in her eyes. Outside, the thunder rolled across the valley, echoing along the mountains that surrounded Serenity Creek. As he finally switched off the lights, he let out a long, slow breath. Life in a small town had been an attempt to bury the ghosts of Operation Horizon Storm. Now, those ghosts were stirring again, awakened by the promise of doing the impossible for someone who had nowhere else to turn. And strangely enough, he felt an odd sense of exhilaration, as though a piece of himself that had gone dormant was coming back to life. Stepping into the rain, he pulled his hood over his head, the droplets hissing around him. He wondered if Zora was still out there or if she had already whisked herself away into the night with her advanced technology. Either way, there was no turning back. The path they had begun would lead them both into uncharted territory, each step as tentative and as vital as the first time someone rediscovers the ability to walk. With that thought in mind, Marcos ventured into the darkness, unaware of just how much this journey would change the very fabric of both his and Zora's worlds. The next few weeks slipped by in a blur of after-hours sessions and long nights of research for Marcos Flynn. The tiny town of Serenity Creek slept soundly while a Gendaran envoy and an ex-combat medic worked quietly behind the drawn blinds of his modest clinic. Every evening, Zora Avant's hover chair appeared in the doorway, its soft azure glow sending dancing lights across the floor tiles, and she and Marcos tackled yet another stage of her uncharted rehabilitation. At first, the routine felt almost surreal. Once he finished with his daytime patients, those seeking relief from sprained ankles or chronic back pain, Marcos would lock up and wait. He'd review the intricate Gendaran medical files she had provided, diagrams of quantum nerve interfaces, multi-layered spinal structures, and pages upon pages of data on something called the vital energy lattice. Much of it was beyond anything in Earth medicine, reading more like science fiction than reality. But Marcos saw hints of patterns that echoed the unusual injuries he'd encountered during Operation Horizon Storm, where his improvised treatments saved soldiers who defied conventional prognosis. Zora's progress was steady, yet delicate. At each session, Marcos mapped the faint hum of energy that ran along her spine. One evening, he discovered a precise rotation of her pelvis triggered a surge of warmth that raced down both thighs, causing muscle twitches she could partly control. This led to brief moments where she could flex her ankles or wiggle a few toes at will, though the accomplishments would vanish the moment the energy flow receded. It reminded Marcos of a radio signal that flickered in and out depending on how he angled the antenna. Despite the hopeful advances, shadows of uncertainty gathered around them. Zora's mentions of the Gendaran Council grew more frequent and more ominous. "They've had my case under review for years," she said during one session, as he gently stretched her hamstrings. "But I'm pushing boundaries now by coming to you, an unsanctioned Earth practitioner. Some council members support me, believing there's potential in cross-species medicine. Others see it as a foolish gamble." Marcos exhaled through his nose, keeping his focus on the subtle pulses under his hands. "What's the worst they can do? Deny you travel permissions?" Zora looked away. "The council wields significant authority. They can, in theory, recall me to Jandara by force, claiming I'm endangering diplomatic relations by engaging in unauthorized treatments. My position as an envoy only offers so much protection. And if they deem my continued paralysis a liability, it complicates everything." He caught the flicker of pain in her golden eyes. It was more than just physical frustration. Her entire cultural identity hinged on physical perfection. The idea of extended disability in Gendaran society was as good as a stigma, something she'd hinted at but never fully elaborated. Understanding it made Marcos's protective instincts flare up. He remembered how certain Earth militaries once scorned soldiers who couldn't keep up, branding them as unfit. It angered him to think of Zora facing a similar verdict on her own planet. So they worked on often past midnight, fueled by coffee on his part and sheer determination on hers. Day by day, the flickers of movement in her lower body became more consistent, her sense of connection more tangible. Yet every small victory cast a deeper shadow, as if warning them that their borrowed time could be snatched away by an authority neither fully controlled. It was on the evening of their 5th week of collaboration that the first real storm brewed. A storm not just of rain and rolling thunder, but of confrontation. Outside, the wind howled through Serenity Creek's narrow streets, rattling window panes and tearing at the few lonely street lamps. Inside the clinic, under warm overhead lighting, Zora lay on the treatment table while Marcos methodically activated each pressure point he'd identified along her spine. He circled his thumbs near the base of her ribs, eliciting a visible shiver in her legs. "That's it," he said quietly, feeling a subtle ripple of energy. "Can you move your right foot?" She inhaled, concentrating. Marcos watched in anticipation as her foot jerked in a halting but undeniable flex. Zora let out an exhilarated laugh. Yes, I can feel that spot more strongly tonight. Before he could respond, a shrill alarm abruptly cut through the calm. Marcos stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over a tray of medical tools. Clinic security system, he muttered, hurrying to a small wall monitor that displayed a grainy feed of the parking lot. Three unmarked black vehicles hovered ominously by the entrance, their sleek exterior panels reflecting the swirling rain. People, tall, athletic silhouettes, were stepping out, each clad in dark uniforms that Marcos didn't recognize. Zora followed his gaze, bracing herself on the edge of the table. Marcos, that's the Gendaran enforcement team. They must have traced my location. He felt a jolt of adrenaline, as if the old war zone reflexes that had lain dormant were snapping awake. Are you in danger from them? Her expression was grim. They have authority to enact protective custody if they deem me an asset at risk. In other words, they can force me to return to Yandara, either to go through official therapy or to be replaced by a more suitable envoy. A low growl built in Marcos's throat, surprising even himself. Over my dead body, he muttered, turning to lock the front doors. He'd installed reinforced frames some months back, not because he foresaw interplanetary conflicts, but because the old windows rattled too much during storms. Now he hoped they might buy a few seconds. The enforcers wasted no time. The front door burst inward with a burst of greenish-blue sparks. Hinges snapped from the force. The lead figure stepped through, tall, slate-gray skin, wearing a segmented jumpsuit that glistened like liquid metal. Behind him, three others formed a wedge-like formation. Envoy avant, the leader intoned, ignoring the howling wind and rain swirling through the destroyed entrance. By order of the High Gendaran Council, you are required to accompany us immediately for reassessment of your physical condition. Marcos placed himself squarely between them and Zora. This is a private medical facility under Earth jurisdiction, he said firmly, heart pounding. You can't just barge in here. The leader's golden eyes shifted coolly to Marcos. Human, your involvement is incidental. The envoy must be returned to Gendara for her own welfare. Zora shot the enforcers a scathing look. My welfare? This is about the council preserving their precious image of perfection. I won't go. Not yet. The tension was as thick as the storm clouds outside, swirling with the promise of a violent discharge. Marcos felt the residual weight of his old training, the readiness to act, the sense that he could handle himself in a confrontation if need be. Still, these were Gendarans, stronger, possibly better armed. He glanced at Zora, who gripped the table's edge with pale knuckles, and realized he had no choice. Marcos hadn't fought anyone since leaving the service, but muscle memory resurfaced with startling clarity. As the lead enforcer lunged forward, aiming a sleek baton that crackled with energy, Marcos sidestepped and swept the weapon aside in a fluid motion. A second enforcer took advantage of the opening, bringing a silver device to bear. But Marcos twisted the attacker's wrist at the last second, sending the device clattering to the floor in a shower of sparks. Chaos erupted in the clinic. The overhead lights flickered, half from the storm's fury outside and half from the energy discharges colliding in the small space. The enforcers, apparently surprised by Marcos's adeptness, regrouped. Stand down, human, the squad leader growled, leveling an energy pistol at Marcos. We have authorization to neutralize threats to our mission. Marcos's breath thundered in his ears, but he forced a steadiness into his voice. Last warning, you're on Earth and you're assaulting a civilian medical facility. That won't look good on any diplomatic report. He saw a flicker of hesitation in the enforcer's eyes, just long enough for him to pivot behind a therapy table. The next instant, a pulse of green-blue energy sizzled across the room. It struck the wall, leaving a faint scorch mark on the plaster. Behind him, Zora had maneuvered her hover platform. She pressed several buttons, and a kinetic barrier shimmered briefly around her torso. Marcos guessed it was an emergency shield. Her face was set in grim determination. Then one enforcer made a fateful error. He rushed Marcos in an attempt to pin him. But Marcos seized the man's arm, pivoted his hips, and flung him into the nearest wall using a standard grappling maneuver from his combat medic days. The enforcer slumped, disoriented, Before any of the others could respond, Zora unleashed a sudden pulse from her chair's console. It wasn't lethal, but it sent a wave of impact that sent the remaining two stumbling. Seizing the moment, Marcos lunged, disarming the squad leader. With a swift motion, he had the pistol out of the leader's grasp, pressing an elbow against his windpipe. The third operative, still standing, froze, clearly recalculating. "Don't," Marcos hissed, voice low, "unless you'd like a demonstration of just how protective we humans can be." The wounded enforcer on the floor groaned. The leader, pinned by Marcos's forearm, met his gaze with a mixture of fury and begrudging respect. "You're making a mistake," he rasped. "Envoy Avanth belongs under Gendaran care. This rebellious act could spark significant repercussions." Zora glided closer, maintaining the faint kinetic shield around her. "Perhaps if your medical systems had actually helped me walk, we wouldn't be here. It's not rebellion. I have the right to choose my own path to recovery." Marcos tightened his hold fractionally. The stoic acceptance on the squad leader's face told him that a direct brawl would only end in more violence. This had to be resolved in some manner that wouldn't lead to an interplanetary incident. Even as adrenaline hammered in his veins, Marcos forced himself to speak calmly. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave. This is a recognized medical practice on Earth, and Zora is my patient, voluntarily. If you try to take her by force again, we'll call in Earth authorities, and you'll have an even bigger mess on your hands." From behind him, Zora added, "And I will file a formal protest with the Gendaran Council. If you claim to care about protocol, you'll stop this nonsense right now." One of the unarmed enforcers helped his companion off the floor. The squad leader, pinned against Marcos's forearm, shifted as if testing for a possible counterattack. But the Earth soldier's grip was unyielding. Finally, the Gendaran leader growled something that sounded like an alien oath and gave a tight nod. Reluctantly, Marcos released him, stepping back but staying alert. The leader massaged his neck, his gaze sliding venomously toward Zora. "You have 2 Earth weeks," he spat. "2 weeks to demonstrate measurable progress. If you fail to walk unassisted, the Council will have no choice but to revoke your envoy status and any protection that offers. Understand?" Zora's spine went rigid. "You can't unilaterally decide." The leader cut her off with a slicing gesture through the air. "I suggest you consider it a temporary reprieve. Prove that this so-called therapy is worth the risk you're taking, or face the consequences." They retreated into the storm, retrieving their battered colleagues and leaving the door half off its hinges. A gust of wind roared into the clinic, carrying a cold spray of rain. Zora and Marcos stood in the swirl of damp night air, breathing hard. Her shield flickered and deactivated, the hum of energy subsiding. Finally, Marcos let out a shaky laugh, though nothing about the situation was particularly funny. "You all right?" he asked, taking slow steps toward her. Zora looked shell-shocked, eyes still ablaze with tension. "Yes, but how did you—" "Combat medic," he replied, breathing unevenly. "I spent too much time on the front lines. You pick up a few tricks." She exhaled, visibly trying to steady herself. "You took on 4 Gendaran enforcers like it was second nature. They're genetically stronger, you know." Marco shrugged, that old warrior's grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We're surprisingly resilient." Then his grin faded. "They gave us an ultimatum. 2 weeks. So let's figure this out." Zora's eyes flickered with uncertainty, the after effects of adrenaline leaving her trembling slightly. "I've made more progress in a few weeks than I did in a decade, but 2 weeks to walk unassisted? That's ambitious." He set a reassuring hand on her shoulder, ignoring the slight static jolt that passed through him at the contact. "We'll aim high. If you can stand, if you can show real independent steps, maybe that'll shut them up long enough for us to keep going." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper shone in her eyes. For a moment, the tension of the fight melted away, and they stood there, battered door letting in the cold wind, but neither of them wanting to move. The days that followed were a test of endurance, both physical and emotional. Marcos replaced the clinic's door, duct-taped the cracked window, and added a few additional security reinforcements. Zora insisted on covering the ponds, some obscure diplomatic funds she had access to, but the hush-hush nature of it all made the local carpenter raise an eyebrow. Inside the clinic, their nighttime sessions are transformed into urgent marathons of therapy and experimentation. Marcos systematically applied pressure to the points that triggered energy surges, recording their duration and intensity on a digital chart. He also incorporated resistance band exercises, focusing on awakening dormant reflexes. Zora, for her part, pushed her limits day after day, enduring everything from muscle spasms to sheer exhaustion. Their after-session conversations stretched into the early hours of morning. Over lukewarm tea or takeout pizza, which Zora claimed tasted intriguingly sweet and savory, they swapped bits of personal history. Marcos confessed how the war had changed him, how each fallen soldier weighed on his conscience. Zora shared how her culture's obsession with physical perfection had left her feeling inadequate ever since her accident. On the 8th night after the enforcer attack, Marcos suggested they attempt standing practice. Zora tensed, her usually confident demeanor flickering. "I haven't stood on my own in a decade," she whispered, brushing a hand over her hover chair. "What if I can't do it? What if this entire thing collapses?" Marcos moved behind her, hands settling lightly on her upper arms. "We'll go slow. I'll be here. And if it doesn't work tonight, we try again tomorrow." She nodded, swallowing audibly. With Marcos's careful guidance, she placed her feet on the floor, both feet, while gripping the parallel bars he'd installed for walking exercises. Her legs trembled fiercely, and he could see the play of tense muscle beneath her lavender skin. 1, 2, 3, he counted softly, and she hoisted herself upright. Marcos supported her hips, offsetting the load. Her arms quivered with effort, but she was standing, no hover chair, only the bars and Marcos's presence for balance. A rush of exhilaration sparked through the room, akin to static electricity. Zora's face contorted with effort, but her eyes were alight with fierce, unyielding pride. I'm up," she gasped. Encouraged, Marcos helped her take a single step forward, her right foot moving almost normally, though unsteady. The left foot dragged a little, but then she managed a shaky second step. By the third, she was panting with the intensity of it. "You're doing great," Marcos murmured, bracing her shoulders. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, matching the intensity in his racing heart. Zora let out a choked laugh. "We call this great? My entire body feels like it's on fire." "That's progress," he said gently. "Your muscles are reawakening. You're fighting to reclaim what's yours." In that moment, Zora's legs buckled. She pitched sideways, and Marcos lunged to catch her, arms wrapping around her torso. She clung to him, their faces mere inches apart, the clinic's soft overhead light reflecting in her golden irises. Time seemed to stall. With her breath quick and shallow, she managed a half smile. "For a physically weaker species, you're surprisingly reliable, Marcos Flynn." He laughed, a low, throaty sound. "Don't let my species hear you say that. We're a proud bunch." In the hush that followed, neither immediately drew back. Marcos's arms stayed curled around Zora's waist, while her hands rested on his shoulders. After a moment, he hoisted her gently into her hover chair to keep her from collapsing onto the floor. She sat there, catching her breath, cheeks tinged with what might have been an embarrassment or something else. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice soft. I, I've forgotten what it felt like to stand on my own 2 feet, even briefly. It's overwhelming." Marcos nodded, trying to steady his own breathing. "You did better than I expected for a first attempt. It's a huge deal." He pressed a hand to his neck, the residual sensation of holding her close, leaving an odd warmth through his veins. "Tomorrow we'll try for a few more steps." "Tomorrow," she repeated, still staring at him as if searching for something in his expression. He cleared his throat and glanced at the wall clock, noting it was far past midnight. "You must be exhausted. Let's wrap up for tonight." Zora nodded absently, fiddling with the control panel to reset her chair. Its hum resumed at a lower intensity, elevating her a few inches. "The enforcer's ultimatum. We've got less than a week left. But I think if I can show them real walking, they might back off." Marcos pressed his lips into a grim line. "Yeah, or they'll just find a new excuse to haul you off. We can't rely on them to be fair-minded. But let's do what we can. Focus on the therapy." Her golden gaze flicked to the scorched mark on the clinic wall. a bitter reminder of the fight. I've seen how far they'll go. I won't let them bully me again. And I appreciate that you won't either. He tried a lopsided smile, refusing to admit how deeply he cared about her well-being. Wouldn't be much of a therapist if I let you get dragged off, right? She just shook her head, turning toward the exit. You're more than just a therapist, Marcos. They didn't elaborate, but the space between them felt charged, as if words unsaid hovered in the air. By the time Marcos walked her to the damaged door, still waiting for final repairs, his mind was whirling. The attraction, no, the connection between them had grown into something neither could fully deny. It went beyond patient and healer, beyond earthling and Gendaran. I'll see you tomorrow, Zora said quietly. She hesitated, and for a heartbeat, Marcos wondered if she was going to say or do something that would irrevocably change things. Instead, she only offered a grateful nod before guiding the hover chair into the cold night. He stood under the flickering porch light, watching until her outline dissolved into darkness. The drizzle had lessened, and the clouds were shifting, revealing a starlit sky. Somewhere out there, Jendara orbited in his distant corner of space. And here he was, a man who fled conflict and heartbreak, now swept up in an interplanetary tangle that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. For 2 more evenings, they drilled the standing exercises. Each time, Zora improved slightly, one more step, one longer moment upright without clinging to the bars. But the progress wasn't linear. Occasionally, her muscles spasmed, or the energy conduits flickered, and she'd lose all mobility for hours. Marcos's frustration was palpable. He took it out on himself, pacing the clinic after she'd left, replaying each session in his mind, wondering if there was a different technique that might speed things along. Late one night, he'd pored over her Gendaran diagrams again, half-eaten takeout forgotten on the desk. A single annotation in the data caught his attention. Gendaran neural lattices sometimes responded to external frequency stimulation. In simpler terms, music or vibrational waves might help realign blocked conduits. The notion reminded Marcos of some Earth therapies that used ultrasound or vibration platforms to stimulate nerve function. The next day, they decided to test a makeshift approach. Marcos borrowed a portable speaker from his old military gear and set it to produce low-frequency vibrations while he worked through Zora's spine manipulations. The result was immediate, a stronger surge of muscle responses, especially in her thighs and calves. By the final night before the Enforcer's 2-week deadline, Zora managed to shuffle across a span of 6 feet using only minimal support from Marcos. It was hardly perfect, but it was walking, pure, genuine steps. They both cheered, a wave of giddy relief washing over them. That sense of triumph was short-lived. As Zora finished dressing, slipping back into her formal jumpsuit in case the Enforcers showed up again, they heard the rumble of vehicles outside. Marcos peered through the narrow window slat and counted 3 sleek transports. "Looks like your friends are here," he muttered. Zora's jaw tightened. "They're a day early." Sure enough, 4 Gendarans in official-looking uniforms strode into the clinic's waiting area. This time, though, they didn't blast the door off its hinges. The lead figure, clad in a stiff black mantle, was different from the squad leader who'd attacked them. He surveyed the premises with cool detachment before stating in clear English, "Envoy avant, Dr. Flynn, the council requires an update on your progress immediately." Marcos squared his shoulders, glancing at Zora. She inhaled, nodded once, then directed her hover chair to the center of the therapy area. "Let's show them," she said, her voice calm but carrying an underlying tremor. With a deep breath, she disengaged the hover feature and let the chair rest on the ground. Marcos offered his hand, fully aware that the Gendarans were observing every nuance. Zora accepted his help, pulling herself to a standing position with minimal assistance. Then, to everyone's silent astonishment, she took a step, one foot in front of the other, wobbly but unassisted. Another step followed. 2, 3. Marcos hovered near her elbow, ready to catch her if she faltered. The Gendarans exchanged quick glances in their own language, which Marcos couldn't fully follow. But he caught one phrase repeated: unprecedented. A tall official with silver epaulets finally spoke. "Envoy avant, this progress defies the Council's prior assessments, yet we cannot consider it conclusive. Are you prepared for further evaluation on Jendara?" Zora leaned against Marcos, breath ragged. I'll undergo any tests you require, provided I remain on Earth for now. My therapy isn't finished, and I refuse to let you dismantle it prematurely. The lead official's golden eyes flicked from Zora to Marcos. Your request is out of order, but perhaps an arrangement can be made. The council will deliberate. With that, they withdrew as abruptly as they came, leaving behind an uneasy quiet that felt heavier than before. As soon as they were gone, Zora's legs buckled, and Marcos scooped her into his arms, lowering her carefully into the hover chair. She let out a shaky exhale, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. They saw me walk, she whispered. I did it, but it may still not be enough. Marcos brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. We'll make it enough, he vowed, heart thumping like a war drum in his chest. For 3 days after the Gendaran officials' abrupt visit, the rain refused to ease up over Serenity Creek. A low-hanging veil of clouds blanketed the valley, soaking the dusty roads and forming broad mud patches in the open fields. Despite the bleak weather, word of strangers entering Marcos Flynn's clinic began circulating through the quiet town. Locals whispered about black hover vehicles and the battered doorframe at the clinic, though no one quite knew who or what had come knocking. A few curious eyes peered through windows and half-cracked doors, but for the most part, they kept their distance. Serenity Creek was accustomed to leaving folks alone, and Marcos usually kept to himself. Still, the tension felt palpable, like the electricity that presaged a thunderstorm. Inside the clinic, Marcos and Zora Avanth prepared for the next potential confrontation. Zora had taken to resting between physical therapy drills, reading through Earth medical texts that Marcos had left on a shelf. Occasionally, she found sections of these old textbooks amusing. Some of Earth's cutting-edge knowledge was centuries behind Gendaran standards, but she admired the hands-on, intuitive approach that Marcos embodied. Whenever she glanced at him, her eyes gleamed with both gratitude and the unspoken bond they had forged. More often than not, however, her brows furrowed with worry. Every day that passed might bring fresh trouble from the council. Marcos, on the other hand, no longer tried to deny what was growing between them. He spent his off hours scanning the updated Gendaran data that Zora provided, constantly searching for any clue that might give her an edge in regaining full mobility. He also discovered that the council had started sending polite but pointed digital missives, bureaucratic language that boiled down to, prove your methods are viable, or we will forcibly recall Envoy Avon. They're ramping up the pressure, Zora said one evening, gliding her hover chair beside the physical therapy bars. She scrolled through a new file on the console, which featured a set of forms from the Gendaran Diplomatic Corps. This one wants a full written report on your procedures, plus daily biometrics. They're calling it oversight. Marcos grimaced. In other words, they're looking for evidence that we're failing, or that I'm some renegade who endangers your health. Zora nodded, eyebrows pinched. They still can't comprehend that a low-tech approach might actually succeed where their advanced methods failed. But it's not all hostility. A few more moderate factions want to learn from you. They see the potential in bridging Gendaran science with Earth's emphasis on tactile, more personalized care. He helped her position at the bars, carefully aligning her feet. So we either convert the skeptics or show them enough progress that they back off. Precisely, Zora breathed. We need definitive proof I can walk independently, or at the very least, that I'm on an irreversible path to recovery. Marcos wrapped an arm lightly around her waist, guiding her upright. We're close, and if they still try to pull you out of here, Zora glanced at him sidelong, lips curving into a small smile. You'll fight a squadron of enforcers again? Absolutely, he replied, voice unwavering. But my hope is to do something even more effective. Convince them you don't need to be dragged back at all. They both knew it was easier said than done, but they pressed on. Each passing day, Zora took more steps between the parallel bars, able to grip them for balance instead of relying solely on Marcus's support. Occasionally, she managed to stand for several minutes, trembling but upright. During those moments, as she struggled not to collapse, she sometimes caught Marcos's gaze. Steady, encouraging, warm, and realized she was fighting for more than just her own mobility. She was fighting for the life they could only begin to imagine, if she stayed. A week later, the infamous Gendaran oversight arrived in the form of two officials who demanded daily demonstrations of Zora's progress. One was Tarek, a poised and unsmiling male with pale violet skin and silver markings that denoted some high-level administrative rank. The other was Nasa, shorter and younger, sporting an array of metallic pins on her collar, likely signifying a medical specialization. They arrived every afternoon in a small shuttle that rumbled over the dirt roads, scanning the area with open suspicion. Marcos quickly came to respect Nasa's professional demeanor. She was curious about Earth methods, quietly jotting notes on a floating digital slate while watching Zora walk her measured steps along the therapy bars. Tarek, conversely, stood with arms folded, his glare traveling between Zora and Marcos as though waiting for them to slip up. Whenever Zora managed to move a few steps independently, Tarek merely narrowed his eyes and typed terse comments into his own device. I remain unconvinced this is the ideal environment for recovery, Tarek remarked on the second day of observation, tone dripping with doubt. A single small-town clinic on a backwater planet hardly seems adequate for advanced therapy. You're entitled to your opinion, Marcos replied coolly, but Zora's made more progress in these walls than she did in a decade of your top facilities. Nasa nodded, brushing a strand of honey-colored hair behind her ear. He isn't wrong, Tarek. I've studied Envoy Avant's medical history. The neural conduction improvements are indeed significant. She turned to Zora. Have you been experiencing any discomfort or setbacks? Some muscle spasms, Zora answered, pressing a hand to her right thigh. Marcos and I have been using vibration therapy to address them. Each time we stimulate the energy conduits correctly, my voluntary control increases. Tarek let out a scoff. Earth technology is primitive. It's more likely a natural recovery cycle coinciding with these, interventions. Nasa's lips thinned. Possibly, yet the correlation is striking. Zora gave an irritated sigh. If you wish to claim this is all coincidence, that's your prerogative. The point is, I'm standing and walking where once there was no hope at all. The tension in the clinic felt like a coiled spring, and it didn't help that townspeople sometimes peeked through the entrance windows, curious about the tall, lavender-skinned visitors who arrived daily in a humming shuttle. Marcos occasionally waved them away with a polite but firm gesture. He didn't want a crowd or questions he couldn't yet answer. That evening, after Tarek and Nasa left, Marcos found Zora sitting on the therapy table, her expression distant. You okay? He asked gently. Stepping up beside her, she shrugged, a rare gesture of raw emotion surfacing in her otherwise composed visage. Tarek isn't just any official. He's connected. If he decides to push for a forced recall, the council will likely side with him. My progress might not matter. Marcos gripped her shoulder. But you heard Nasa. She sees the change in your nerve functions. She's a medical expert, right? That has to count for something. Zora searched his face, her golden gaze brimming with a mix of vulnerability and resolve. Yes, but Jindarin politics is a delicate dance, and evidence doesn't always trump reputation or a tradition. She paused, then added softly, That's why I need you, someone fearless about forging a new path, no matter how many times we're told it's impossible. Marcos's heart thudded once, heavily. He considered telling her how for him, this wasn't just about defying the odds anymore. It was about wanting her to stay, no matter where interplanetary laws dictated she should go. Instead, he just squeezed her hand. Then let's keep making the impossible happen. In the days that followed, Tarek continued to cast a cynical shadow over each demonstration, but Nasa grew increasingly fascinated by Marcus's methods. She asked questions about muscle memory, about how hands-on manipulation could remind the body to function, and about how Earth's simpler technology, like vibration therapies, could sometimes succeed where advanced scanners fell short. On Jandara, she told them one afternoon, our approach is to rely on devices that do the fine-tuning for us. Our healers rarely perform manual therapy. That's considered archaic. Yet seeing Envoy Avant's progress, I can't deny there might be an element we've overlooked. Marcos watched Zora complete a careful half-circle around the therapy area. No bars, only a light brace at each knee to keep her legs stable. She was drenched in sweat, hair clinging to her temples, but she beamed triumphantly at Nasa. The enforcer from weeks ago could never have imagined this scenario. A Gendaran envoy walking, unthinkable as it once was, in a small Wyoming clinic. The next big goal, Marco said, handing Zora a water bottle, is to strengthen her stabilizers so she can stand for longer periods without bracing. We're getting there, but it'll take more time. Tarek sniffed. Time. Precisely what we're running out of. The Council is demanding tangible evidence that Envoy Avanth can fulfill her duties without the hindrance of a hover chair. I have to send them a report that states when we can expect full functionality. Zora bristled at the word hindrance, but she forced a polite smile. Perhaps you could mention that I'm walking as we speak. Hardly a minor improvement. It remains to be seen whether you can maintain this without constant Earth intervention. Tarek responded icily. Gendaran envoys must be fully independent. Sensing her frustration, Marco stepped forward. Look, you can write your report however you like, but facts are facts. If you want a timeline, we're working as fast as possible. Rushing it could lead to setbacks. NASA interjected softly. I'll note that caution in my medical assessment. Real healing can't be forced by strict deadlines. Tarek's glare held steady on Zora. Then I expect you to keep pushing. If the Council deems your progress insufficient, they may replace you regardless of your personal achievements. Zora's face went pale, that old fear flickering across her features. Replacement meant more than just losing a charm. It meant public humiliation on Hindara, being viewed as broken and unfit for high-level service. For years, she'd fought to retain her post, to prove that an accident wouldn't define her fate. Now, after coming this far, the thought of being stripped of her position and forcibly removed from Earth felt like a second, cruel injury. After Tayarik and Nasa departed, Marcos helped Zora sink onto a chair in the back office. Don't let him get in your head, he said gently, kneeling beside her. He's just... She pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. It's not just him. It's everyone on Gendara who thinks a person with any physical imperfection is useless. I wish they could understand that our injuries don't erase our worth. Her voice quivered, an echo of years spent battling invisible judgments. Marcos placed a hand over hers. They'll learn, he said quietly. We'll make them. That evening, after locking up the clinic, Marcos found himself steering Zora out to his old pickup truck. Despite her hover chair, she had insisted on trying short walks outside, eager to reclaim daily activities Earth dwellers took for granted. The truck was a relic from his pre-military days, rusted in spots, paint peeling. But Zora smiled at it as if it were a fascinating glimpse of human culture. You, sure about this? He asked, keeping one arm around her waist as she climbed into the passenger seat. It's not exactly anti-gravity comfort. She managed to heft herself onto the seat, Ahmed, wincing only slightly. I want to see more of this town. Also, I'm curious what you do after you close the clinic. You can't spend all your time waiting for me to show up. Can you? He hesitated, aware of how personal this was becoming. So much of their shared time had revolved around therapy, progress updates, and fending off official scrutiny. Yet a quiet part of him wanted this, wanted the chance to show her a piece of his life that wasn't strictly medical. All right, he said, shutting the passenger door gently before jogging around to the driver's side. The sky had mostly cleared, patches of starlight breaking through the thinning cloud cover. As the truck rumbled to life, Zora glanced at him with amusement. The engine is quite loud. Yeah, well, I can't exactly afford fancy updates. Besides, some people think it adds character. He pulled onto the main road, tires splashing through leftover puddles. The few street lamps in Serenity Creek cast long shadows, illuminating the shuttered shops and a single diner that stayed open late. Half a dozen pickup trucks were parked around it, likely belonging to farmers grabbing a cup of coffee after a day's labor. Zora rolled down the window an inch, letting in the night breeze. She inhaled deeply. It smells so fresh out here. On Jandara, most cities are built with climate-controlled domes to regulate our environment. Weather is carefully moderated. He gestured to the wide, open land beyond the diner's glow, the silhouettes of distant mountains barely visible. We've got regulation too, but it's more minimal. Earth weather can be unpredictable, but there's a certain freedom in that. They passed through the sparse downtown area and headed toward an overlook just beyond the last row of houses. From there, the terrain sloped upward, offering a vantage point over the entire valley. Marcos parked on a grassy patch beside the winding road. Stepping out, he helped Zora descend, careful with each motion. Leaning against the truck, the two gazed over the moonlit sweep of fields, where little pinpricks of light marked scattered farms. Crickets chirped, their rhythmic calls blending with the lingering drip of water from the truck's undercarriage. For a moment, they said nothing, content to absorb the rare tranquility. Finally, Zora broke the silence, her voice tinged with awe. "You mentioned once that you came here to escape your past, to find peace. Standing here, I can see why. It's like the world fades away in this stillness." Marcos nodded, recalling his first night in Serenity Creek years ago, drawn by the emptiness and quiet. "After I left the military, I needed somewhere that wouldn't remind me of what I'd seen. War had a way of turning everything into potential chaos. This place felt safe." She glanced at him, a soft glow in her golden eyes. "And now you've found chaos again, in the form of a Gendaran who showed up demanding your help." He laughed, the sound echoing lightly across the fields. "Yeah, but maybe it's a good kind of chaos, because for once it feels like I'm really making a difference, and not just patching people up to send them back into battle." Zora's gaze lingered on him. "That difference includes me, you know. You're not just healing a Gendaran envoy. You're helping me rediscover who I am without this constant fear of being labeled broken." His throat tightened. He wanted to reach for her hand, but wasn't sure if it crossed a line. Then he realized they had already stepped over so many lines that formality seemed laughable. He laced his fingers with hers, breath catching at the gentle pressure of her alien skin. "You're not broken. Not to me," he said quietly. Zora squeezed his hand, the friction of her warm palm sending a small thrill through him. She opened her mouth, perhaps to respond, but the moment was cut short by the unexpected muffled buzz of her hover chair's comm device inside the truck. She blinked apologetically and moved to retrieve it. Marcos followed, helping her maneuver around the door. As soon as she activated the console, a holographic interface sprang up, dimly illuminating the dark interior of the truck cabin. The Gendaran official crest flickered, followed by Tarek's stern face. The moment Zora saw him, her posture stiffened. "Yes?" she said tersely, holding the panel so Marcos could see as well. Tarek's voice resonated with a mild distortion, likely from traveling interstellar channels. "Envoy Avant, I'm relaying an update from the Council. They've decided to dispatch a High Commissioner to oversee your final evaluation. This commissioner has authority beyond NASA's or mine. Should the commissioner deem your progress insufficient or your situation compromised, you will be mandated to return to Yendara immediately." Marcos felt Zora's hand tremor slightly in his. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice carefully level. "Commissioner Rivari," Tarek answered. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. "You know his reputation. He's thorough, unwavering in protocol. If you intend to prove the merits of this Earth-based therapy, you'll have to show undeniable results. Otherwise, he'll have all the justification he needs to recall you." Zora exhaled slowly, trying to mask the sudden tension that turned her knuckles white. "I understand. When does he arrive?" "Within 3 Earth days. Be prepared." Tarek hesitated, then added, "I'd advise you to rest well, Envoy. This is your last opportunity to convince the Council. Do not waste it." The hologram blinked out, leaving the truck's interior dark again, save for the faint overhead light. Marcos leaned against the passenger seat, a knot forming in his stomach. He recalled the battered door to his clinic and the menacing presence of Gendaran enforcers. Now a new threat loomed, someone with the clout to undermine all they had accomplished. "This is bigger than we thought, isn't it?" he muttered. Zora nodded, swallowing hard. "Rivari is one of the highest authorities in interplanetary relations. He can override nearly any decision. If he deems my therapy here inadequate or my conduct improper..." Marcos's mind flashed through worst-case scenarios. Zora taken away, forced back to a place that saw her as damaged goods, or possibly an outright diplomatic clash if she refused. He felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it nearly stole his breath. "We won't let it come to that," he said more fiercely than he intended. She studied his face by the dim glow of moonlight. Marcos, what if... He gently cupped her cheek, stopping her protest. We have 3 days to make this as solid as possible. You're already standing and walking short distances. Our job is to keep strengthening you until no one can deny that this is the best place for your recovery. Her golden eyes searched his. But even if I stand perfectly for 5 minutes in front of Ruvari, that might not suffice. He may claim that I'd be better served by advanced Gendaran techniques. Then we'll prove him wrong, Marcus murmured, his hand drifting from her cheek to hers. We'll show him the one thing no fancy device has given you: independence. Over the next 72 hours, Marcos and Zora launched into an intensive regimen. If rest was Tarek's advice, they largely ignored it, preferring to squeeze out every ounce of progress possible before Commissioner Ruvari's arrival. They spent mornings in the clinic's main room, running through stability exercises, squats with a safety harness, heel-to-toe walks with minimal support, seated leg raises. Zora grimaced and sweated through each repetition, her face a mask of fierce resolve. Afternoons were devoted to a blend of Gendaran and Earth concepts. NASA helped set up a makeshift quantum resonance station using one of Zora's portable devices. When combined with Marcos's vibration therapy and manual manipulation of energy pressure points, they achieved stronger, more consistent nerve signals in her lower body. Tarek, arms perpetually folded, observed from a distance, silently taking notes. If he ever felt a flicker of admiration, he hit it well. By the second night of this marathon schedule, the strain on Zora was evident. She trembled from muscle fatigue, occasionally stumbling even with support. Marcos insisted on breaks to avoid injury, but she pressed onward, determined to leave no doubts in Ruvari's mind. Late at night, they took quiet walks along the clinic's corridor. Each time, she managed more steps without leaning on the walls, though the effort plainly taxed her. Despite the physical hardship, moments of closeness threaded through the exhaustion. Once, after a particularly strenuous bout of balance training, Zora sagged against Marcos's chest, panting. He held her gently, inhaling the faint scent of her hair, a mix of ozone and something floral from a Gendaran conditioner. In that small sanctuary of shared breath, they both felt the pulse of something more profound than patient-therapist rapport. Neither named it aloud, but it radiated warmth through the fatigue. The night before Ruvari's arrival, a heavy tension weighed on them. Nasa had returned to her temporary lodgings, while Tayarik paced outside the clinic, making more reports to the council. Marcos sat with Zora on the therapy table, her legs draped over the side, both of them sipping water and trying not to show their mutual anxiety. An overhead light cast a soft pool around them, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. Tomorrow, she whispered, I have to show him everything. Everything. Walk, stand, maybe even climb a step or two if I can. He'll scrutinize every wobble, every moment of imbalance. One slip and he'll declare me unfit. Marcos placed a calming hand on her knee. One slip won't undo everything. You've already proven so much. He hesitated, then added, and if it still isn't enough, I'll go with you to Yindara. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. You'd leave Earth for me? The question hung between them like a spark in the air. Marcos swallowed thickly. I'm not saying I'd be happy about it, but if they force you to go, maybe I can keep helping, or at least fight for your right to continue this therapy. I won't let you face that alone. A complexity of emotions flickered across her face. Disbelief, gratitude, fear, and something close to joy. She tentatively reached for his hand, interlacing her fingers with his. Marcos, do you realize what that implies? Interplanetary travel, dealing with Gendaran politics, living among people who... He gently squeezed her fingers, cutting off the words tumbling out. I realize it's insane, but if it comes to that, we adapt. That's what we do, right? She gave a watery laugh. We do. You've taught me so much about adaptation. He leaned in, pressing his forehead lightly against hers. Their breaths mingled, the moment suspended by the hush of the clinic and the ragged drum of their hearts. Tomorrow, he said softly, let's show Ruvari who you really are. Not broken, not powerless, but a fighter who reclaimed her body by refusing to give up. Zora's free hand rose to gently cradle his cheek. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. Let's make tomorrow count. They parted late that night in a haze of unspoken confessions, each returning to snatched hours of rest. When the early dawn came, pale light cresting over Serenity Creek's ridges, neither felt fully prepared, but both knew the time had come. Looking back on Marcos and Zora's journey, it's clear that real healing transcends technology or protocol. Their story reminds us that compassion, perseverance, and genuine human connection can overcome what seems impossible, even an interplanetary divide. From the tense battle against Gendaran enforcers to the cautious, hopeful steps Zora took to reclaim her mobility, every moment reinforced one message. We are never truly broken if we refuse to give up on ourselves and each other. I hope you found this tale both inspiring and thought-provoking. Feel free to share your thoughts and personal insights in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. Did any part of the story resonate with your own experiences? Have ideas on how interspecies cooperation could evolve? Join in and let us know. We'd love to hear your opinions and keep this discussion alive.